There is a silence that falls over the American Midwest, a profound quiet that settles across the cornfields after the sun dips below the horizon. In the early 20th century, this was the sound of peace, of security. It was the sound of a world tucked safely in its bed. In the small, thriving town of Villisca, Iowa, a community of 2,500 souls nestled along the busy Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroad line, that peace was considered absolute. Life in Villisca in 1912 followed a comforting, predictable rhythm, governed by the church bells, the train whistles, and the rising sun. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, and the darkness held no fear. At the heart of this idyllic community lived the Moore family. Josiah, 43 years old, was one of the town's most prominent and successful businessmen, the proud manager of the local John Deere dealership. He and his wife, Sarah, 39, were well known and well liked, their family deeply woven into the fabric of the town. Together they raised 4 children in a modest 2-story home on East 2nd Street. 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Mary Catherine, 7-year-old Arthur, and little 5-year-old Paul. Theirs was a life of simple prosperity and community spirit, a perfect portrait of the American dream. Sunday, June 9, 1912, was the last ordinary day they would ever know. The afternoon was spent visiting with family, a weekly ritual. As evening approached, 10-year-old Mary Catherine invited her friends, 8-year-old Ina and 12-year-old Lena Stillinger, to stay the night. The girls were attending a special evening service at the Presbyterian church and, fearing the walk to their grandmother's house in the dark, begged to stay with the Moores. In a decision that would haunt their family for a lifetime, permission was granted. That evening, the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked the short distance to the church to attend the Children's Day program, an event that Sarah Moore herself had meticulously coordinated. For 2 hours, the church was filled with the sounds of children's recitations and songs, a final, beautiful image of a community united in fellowship. At 9:30 p.m., the program ended. The Moores and their 2 young guests emerged into the cool Iowa night. They walked home together, arriving at their house between 9:45 and 10 p.m., their cheerful voices the last sound of life on an otherwise quiet street. They were home. They were safe. The front door closed, the lock was turned, and the house on East 2nd Street fell silent. But they were not alone. An unimaginable evil had already found its way inside and was waiting patiently in the dark. The hours between midnight and dawn are when the world is at its most vulnerable. In the Moore house, 8 people, 6 of them children, slept soundly, unaware of the shadow that moved through their home. The killer's patience was absolute. Perhaps they had watched the family from a knothole in the barn, leaving an imprint in the hay. Perhaps they had slipped in through an unlocked door earlier in the day and hidden themselves away in the sweltering attic, waiting for the house to fall still. The weapon was not one they brought with them. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, taken from the yard and carried inside to become an instrument of annihilation. The slaughter began sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. The killer moved with a chilling, deliberate purpose. They crept up the narrow wooden stairs, bypassing the children's room, and slipped into the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah lay sleeping. They stood over Josiah first. The axe was raised high, so high that it gouged the plaster of the ceiling, and then brought down with unimaginable force upon his head. The killer struck again and again and again, an estimated 30 times in total, until Josiah Moore's face was an unrecognizable pulp, his eyes completely destroyed. The sheer, focused brutality of the first attack suggests a deep, personal rage directed squarely at the head of the household. Sarah was next. In a strange and singular deviation, the killer turned the axe and used the sharp blade on her, while every other victim that night would be bludgeoned with the blunt pole. She was struck before she had time to wake. With the parents dead, the killer moved to the adjacent room and systematically murdered the 4 Moore children as they slept: Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul. Then, the shadow descended the stairs. In the downstairs guest room, Ina and Lena Stillinger lay in their bed. They too were bludgeoned to death. But here, something was different. Investigators would later conclude that 12-year-old Lena had been awake. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting she had tried to fight back against the inevitable. Her body had been posed in a disturbing, sexually suggestive manner, though no evidence of assault was ever found. In a final, horrifying encore, the killer returned to the master bedroom to inflict even more blows upon the lifeless bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore. The rage was spent, the violence was over, but the killer's work was not yet done. What followed was not the panicked flight of a murderer, but a series of calm, bizarre rituals. The killer walked through the blood-spattered house and carefully covered the face of each victim with bedclothes. They then draped pieces of clothing over every mirror and pane of glass, as if they could not bear to see their own reflection, or were following some dark, funereal custom. They took a 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon from the icebox, wrapped it in a towel and left it on the floor of the Stillinger girls' room, near the murder weapon. A bowl of bloody water was found on the kitchen table, evidence that they had calmly washed their hands before departing. Finally, they walked to the front door, locked it from the outside and vanished into the night, leaving behind a house of absolute silence. Monday, June 10th, dawned bright and clear over Villisca, but on East 2nd Street, an unnatural stillness hung in the air. At 7 a.m., the Moores' neighbor, Mary Peckham, grew concerned. The Moore house, usually bustling with activity as the family began their morning chores, was silent. The curtains were all drawn, no one came or went. She walked over and knocked on the front door. There was no answer. She tried the handle and found it locked. A knot of unease tightening in her stomach, Peckham let the Moores' chickens out of their coop and then hurried to her telephone to call Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived shortly after, calling out for his brother, his voice echoing in the quiet street. He received no reply. Using his own copy of the house key, he unlocked the front door and stepped inside, telling Mary Peckham to wait on the porch. The house was dark and stuffy. He made his way into the parlor and opened the door to the downstairs guest room. The sight that greeted him was one of pure horror. In the dim light, he saw the shapes of the 2 Stillinger girls on the bed, their sheets soaked in blood. He recoiled, stumbling back out onto the porch, his face ashen. "Something is terribly wrong," he told Peckham. "Get the marshal." Villisca's primary peace officer, Hank Horton, arrived to a scene he was utterly unprepared for. His search of the house revealed the full, unthinkable scope of the massacre. In the upstairs bedrooms, he found the bodies of Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 children, 8 people slaughtered in their beds. Word of the murders spread through the small town with the speed of a prairie fire. At 8:40 a.m., the central telephone office issued an all call, a single, continuous ring to every phone in town, followed by the terrifying news. Within minutes, the community, gripped by a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity, descended upon the Moore house. The crime scene, the only key to finding the phantom who had done this, was about to be destroyed. The investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders was a catastrophe from the moment it began. Before any proper examination could be conducted, the town marshal allowed dozens of spectators to tramp through the house, their muddy boots obscuring footprints, their hands touching everything. The murder weapon itself was passed from hand to hand. Some ghoulish onlookers even broke off pieces of Josiah Moore's skull as souvenirs. The scene was so hopelessly compromised that any chance of finding reliable physical evidence vanished within hours. The coroner who arrived didn't even bother to take notes. With no physical evidence to guide them, investigators were left with a sea of rumors, accusations, and a growing list of perplexing suspects. The search for the killer became a hunt for a phantom, a descent into a labyrinth of local politics, personal vendettas, and traveling madmen. The first and most prominent local suspect was Frank F. Jones. Jones was an Iowa state senator and the wealthiest, most powerful man in Villisca. Josiah Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving in 1907 to start his own rival implement store, taking the highly profitable John Deere franchise with him. The move had created a bitter rivalry. Fueling the theory were rampant rumors that Josiah had been carrying on an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna. While few believed the 57-year-old senator swung the axe himself, many were convinced he had the motive and the means to hire a killer. The second prime suspect was a man of God, the Reverend George Kelly. A traveling minister of slight build and peculiar habits, Kelly had been in Villisca for the Children's Day program the family had attended. He had a documented history of mental illness and sexually deviant behavior, including peeping in windows. He left town on a train in the early hours of June 10th, before the bodies were discovered. In 1917, he made a shocking confession, claiming that the voice of God had commanded him to slay utterly man and woman, infant and suckling. But his confession was obtained after hours of intense interrogation and was later recanted. He was tried twice. The first jury was hung, the second acquitted him. A private detective had his own theory, a man he dubbed Insane Blackie. His name was William Mansfield, and the detective believed he was a hitman hired by Frank Jones. More than that, he was convinced Mansfield was a serial killer responsible for a string of nearly identical axe murders across the Midwest. The similarities were uncanny: victims bludgeoned with the blunt end of an axe, mirrors covered at the scene. Mansfield seemed a perfect fit until he produced a rock-solid alibi. Payroll records proved conclusively that he was hundreds of miles away in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. A fourth, and perhaps most terrifying possibility emerged: a nameless, faceless evil passing through on the rails. This theory centered on Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims. Several months after the Villisca massacre, Henry Lee Moore murdered his own mother and grandmother with an axe in Columbia, Missouri. The crime was chillingly similar. A federal agent at the time came to believe that Henry Lee Moore was a prolific serial killer responsible for as many as 30 axe murders across the country. Was the slaughter in Villisca simply one stop on a madman's bloody journey through the heartland? The investigation devolved into a public spectacle. The town split along religious and social lines, with accusations flying. The hunt for truth was lost in a fog of conspiracy and hysteria. The killer, whoever he was, had not only murdered 8 people, but had also turned a close-knit community against itself, ensuring his secret would be kept forever. On June 12, 1912, the town of Villisca came to a standstill. The funeral for the 8 victims was held in the open air of the town square to accommodate the thousands who came to pay their respects. The Iowa National Guard was called in to hold back the crowds as a procession of hearses carried 8 caskets to their final resting place. The town mourned, but it would never heal. The murders left a permanent scar on the community, a wound of fear and suspicion that never truly closed. No one was ever convicted. The case remains officially unsolved. The little white house on East 2nd Street still stands. For decades, it passed through the hands of different owners, a place of local dread and morbid fascination. In 1994, it was purchased by historians who meticulously restored it to its 1912 condition, preserving it as a time capsule of the tragedy. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House is a tourist attraction listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It draws in true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators from around the world. Many who spend the night report inexplicable phenomena, the sounds of children's voices, objects moving on their own, and a profound sense of dread that settles in after midnight. In one bizarre incident, a paranormal investigator staying overnight inexplicably stabbed himself, later claiming to have no memory of the event. The house remains the only silent witness to the horror that transpired within its walls. The spirits of the dead, or perhaps just the echoes of an unspeakable tragedy, are all that is left. The identity of the man who walked out of that house on the morning of June 10, 1912, remains one of America's most chilling and enduring mysteries. A powerful rival with a grudge, a mentally ill preacher hearing voices, a ruthless hitman, or a phantom serial killer riding the rails. Who do you think was the Villisca Axe murderer? Let us know your theory in the comments below. If you found this journey into the dark compelling, please like this video and subscribe to The Dark Silent for more explorations of history's most unsettling mysteries. Stay safe, and remember, some silences are never broken.